Clinical psychologist Daniel Den Hollander joins us in the studio once more. So, rage, fury. Today we'll be talking about anger, how it transforms us, the screaming, cursing, and the ramifications of these explosive outbursts and the damage of things that are best left unsaid. We want to understand strategies for controlling our anger to keep it in check. Welcome back, Daniel, and good morning. Great to have you in studio.
Thank you so much for having me back.
So, Daniel, talk to us about anger. Why does it make you feel more angrier when you talk about anger?
I think it comes down to our own discomforts. We're listening to that first WhatsApp message, voice message, and he talks about compassion and kindness, and these are emotions that we are very comfortable to talk about. Anger is as important. It's actually quite a normal, healthy response and quite a necessary response. We don't bring change in if we don't have anger. If we look at the history of our own country, it's a lot of it is fueled by anger and appropriate anger. And it's important also to say that nobody died of anger. What people die of is what we do with anger, how we bring anger across. But if we and this is a very important point, is anger is only an expression of pain. So if you like, of hurt. And there are moments we're often asked to suppress our anger as if anger is a toxic thing, which it's not. But when that happens and anger is suppressed and we focus on the anger and not on the hurts, then we get pockets of space where that anger has a voice, and then it's unregulated. And this is, for me, is a big concern. I'm just quoting Claudel von Eck here, where she says, "See how angry we are. We throw stones, we burn things. It is the pain speaking. Perhaps we know it, perhaps we don't. And they say we are irrational." And there's a lot to unpack in that quote. But that's where it comes down to, is there's a lot of things that we are justified in order to be angry about, but we often don't voice it, and we're not allowed to voice it. And when it comes through in relatively still good ways, immediately it wants to be squashed. And that's a big concern.
Yes, and I think, of course, just listening to you, and when you told me that you're based in Athlone, colleague Walid was talking about just the kind of gang violence that's been happening, and it's always young boys, and it's retaliation, and I often feel there's just such a lot of anger that's not been resolved, and often, myriad of socioeconomic conditions, of course, but there's a lot of anger that we have on the Cape Flats or across our country if we look at our violent protests.
But you cannot understand that anger until you contextualize it. We've got to constantly remember that we were under the regime of a dictator in this country, a psychologist, Verwoerd. And he was hell-bent on breaking down and destroying the family fiber of anybody who wasn't part of who he wanted to support. And we're still seeing the effects of that. If we want to understand what's going on in those areas, if we want to understand gangsterism, we have to first understand the fact that only 39% of children living today have a father in their household. That's a very small percentage. We are living in a fatherless society. I learned how to control my anger through my father. He taught me how to manage my own anger, especially when it felt like I was having injustice taken place with those sibling fights with a sister who was 2 years younger than me. A lot of our people, a lot of our communities are still fatherless. And if we are fatherless, then we're subjected to justice without compassion. And when we have justice without compassion, that's when we're rife to being vulnerable towards the more destructive parts of anger. And you have to see the combination of the two. If you don't, then you're never going to understand how to resolve what's ahead of us.
Daniel, so talk to us about, some of how to manage these triggers and, of course, to control these anger outbursts. I'm not someone who's going to shout or scream, but of course, you are going to get annoyed or irritated by things, but what strategies could you give some of our listeners?
It's such a difficult question to answer authentically in Cape Town. And the reason for that is because there's a social injustice and there's a historical injustice. I again want to, and so, you know, the temptation is to give you 6 tips in order to control your anger. And that's fine and well, but I mean, a Google search will give you the same joy. I think for me, it's about the fact of one of the difficulties that we've got is we only see anger in regards to response to interpersonal violence. The Durban insurrection was a brilliant example of that. What we don't see is the hurt that is caused by structural violence, the hurt that is caused by prejudice, the hurt that is caused by silencing people in their anger. And the problem is, if you silence a person's anger, you also silence their hurt. And when you do that, you dismantle them. I see I've got 4 minutes. I just want to go on this quote.
No, don't feel stressed. We can, time is nothing but just a number there. Continue.
You're very kind. The quote from Claudel van Eck, she wrote a stunning chapter in the book Robert Mangaliso Sobukwe. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I would suggest it. And it's called, the chapter's called The Truth of Who I Am Shall Set Me Free. And this is a quote from there that I think is so pertinent to understanding our condition. She says, "The trauma of being dismantled as a human being to one less than human, cast as the inferior character on the stage of life." And that's what structural violence does to a person. And it's not on you, but it's told it's on you. Rooted in that trauma are elements of, and these I see all the time in my therapy room, insecurity, feelings of low self-confidence, vulnerability, outbursts, and the use of a veneer of arrogance as a means of defense. And so what often happens is the arrogance and the anger gets seen, but not the hurt which caused it, which is a very inappropriate yet suitable position for the one observing. Because the moment that you realize that it comes from a place of hurt, then there's a possibility that you might have been the cause of that hurt, which requires personal responsibility for you. If you don't, then you manifest that anger onto that individual. I don't think it's a coincidence that, for example, we see anger, we immediately start thinking of things like uncivilized, can't keep their cool. As if these are aspirations and abilities that we expect people to have. One of my favorite clients in the room is when I have the absolute privilege of dealing with someone who was part of the 76 youth. What beautiful human beings, as children, able to stand up against a police force that was regarded as one of the most difficult to fight against, stood up as children, had to then go through from 76 to liberation was 91, 94, and had to hold through educating, through rejuvenating that resistance that eventually led to our liberation. And when you come across the youth of 76 now, one of the things that stands for me is a full-on understanding of why we should still be angry. There's a lot of things to be angry about now. And the fact of sometimes being treated by employers and such, and people's prejudice as individuals who are, as she says, trauma of being dismantled as a human being to one less than human. And yet the absolute patience, I don't understand it, the patience and the resilience to bring a change, but in a peaceful way, but still very much rooted in the appropriate and healthy expression of anger.
Daniel, a lot of listeners sending us messages just to say thank you for the amazing talk and the emotional responses to it. And here we need to talk about this more often. We are so angry as a country, and we truly need to heal the anger we have manifested within us. We cannot move forward if we don't heal and the anger, or at least have open dialogue about it. But Daniel, let's talk about, as you said, a healthy way of regulating your anger and the importance of self-awareness.
So there's two elements to this. There's the one which you need to do, and there's the one that you need to do as the community, as the one around. There's a brilliant neuroscientist by the name of Jaak Pensep, and I probably butchered his name, but he talks about rage. He says that anger is at the door of rage. And rage is a motivating response, an impulse response, but an important one that we all need and we all have. You know, you don't want to mess around with a bear cub because the mama's gonna take you out. And according to Jaak, there's two healthy things that rage always wants to do. It wants to motivate us to right the wrongs, and it wants to protect. So when we think about anger, we think about protection. And I think in an extent is to say that when your anger is out of control, when you're constantly suppressing and never in control over your anger, that's when the problem comes in. The great narrative from the movie, the first Avengers movie, they make a slight problem. If you can see, a psychologist wasn't part of the text, but when the Hulk is asked, how do you control your anger? You know that whole scene where the whole movie through they're worrying about the Hulk turning into the Hulk, and he manages to only turn into the Hulk right at the end and win the day. And they ask him, how did you manage to do it? And then there's a great scene where the Hulk says, I'm always angry. You see now,
You're doing it brilliantly, Daniel.
If a psychologist was to write that, we would have changed it just a little bit. And just the small, but it wouldn't have made such a cool quote. We would have changed it to, I'm always aware of my anger. And I think that's the important part, is to always be aware of your anger. So it's really the suppression of it. And we must stop this nonsense of thinking that anger is an uncivilized concept. Like we said before, we shouldn't be scared of anger. We should be scared of aggression. We should be scared of the destructive nature of anger. But we shouldn't be scared of anger. The other thing is that from the community side, and we in South Africa, we talk about community. It's very important. From the community side, when we see anger, when we see people are angry, we should ourselves also be very careful not to suppress it, but to come in realizing that there's a hurt that's been ignored. And the moment that we start doing that, the moment that we start listening, and can I say that listening often is a privileged position. Best example of that was when during the Durban insurrection, I was in Cape Town. My family was in Durban. I grew up in Durban.
Okay.
And I remember my parents being very, very scared, rightfully so, and phoning them in and getting very anxious about it. And I could feel anger. I was also a clinical psychologist working at that time in Eastridge, and I was thinking about seeing about 6 to 8 patients a day at Eastridge. And every person that I was seeing, there was structural violence at the core of why they were seeing me. And I remember feeling angry. And, you know, you can be tempted to separate those two angers. But it was important for me to realize that anger is what connected those two experiences back to myself. I wrote a piece on it. I'm going to do some blatant self-promotion.
Absolutely,
called,
go for it, Daniel.
You can Google it. It's called We Are Angry, We're Anxious, We Are Traumatized, which really starts to unpack that experience for me. But in there was my realization that why am I angry at the threat of my parents' safety being, safety being threatened, but seem to not be so angry about people's safety being threatened by structural violence that happens on a day-to-day basis, which started my own journey in regards to saying, okay, we need to start dealing with structural violence in this country or we will never get better. We have to be,
Okay, interesting, Daniel. So before we obviously wrap up the conversation, can you tell us, are there specific skills or tools that an individual can learn to enhance their emotional regulation and prevent anger from escalating? Because clearly what I'm getting from your insights, Daniel, is that anger is real. We shouldn't hide it, because if you do, things can get worse. But if one has a toolkit, what should be in that toolkit?
You see, we're not going to be able to do a toolkit in 3 minutes,
Okay.
but I think at this point is to realize that your anger comes from a place of hurt. If you can find the hurts and if you can manage the hurts, then you'll manage the anger, because then the anger has no reason to be there anymore. But if you can't, then I think it's very important to speak to a specialist that you trust and who you feel seen and who you feel understands you, and to unpack that hurt. I think the time where anger really gets destructive is when we are hurt, but we don't feel as if anybody is either seeing the hurt or able to stop us from hurting. That's when anger comes in. And I think in that extent as well that's a community response as well, is we need to start to address the social inequalities, to give our brothers and sisters a chance to have relief from their hurts.